Personal journeys through Stoke Newington, my lifestyle guide. I'm Martin Bailey, author, salesman, publisher, distributor of the said lifestyle guide. I dedicate this talk to my daughter, Emily Amanda Bailey. She lived in Stoke Newington for her first 2 years of her life, and her story will be apparent at the end of this presentation. And she came back and lived 2015 to 2018, and now lives down Broadway Market. And her sister Lucy, who shared the last 3 addresses in Stoke Newington, 2015, 2018. Without her, I'd have never have met Amia and had contact with Stoke Newington History Talks. Then to my French wife, Elizabeth, who sat by my side throughout this quite painful publishing project and lived with me, an Aquarian history lover and a wannabe publisher. A change is going to come. The lifestyle guide is inextricably linked to my life and experience in Stoke Newington between the years of 1975 and 1989. I'll begin with some observations and reflections, which I hope will inform and entertain. In 1979, I moved in as a newlywed with my French wife, Elizabeth. We had a rundown flat in Highbury Barn. We moved to a tall ceiling flat, late Victorian flat in Lordship Road. Next door was derelict and remained so for 8 years. Walking down Church Street in the early 1980s, as I frequently did, took me through a world never far away from a sewing machine, a sheet of corrugated iron, and past pubs that dreamt of better days. All in all, the signs of decay of the old Stoke Newington were everywhere. The huge Georgian terrace past Defoe Road was shabby and underused. Similarly, the area around what became the Vortex Art Suppliers and later jazz venue consisted of a huge hole in the ground and much very dodgy wire fencing. I clearly remember peeking inside the clothing factory that became Oyatex, numbers 71 to 73. I couldn't resist it. Under old bright strip lights, 20 or more sewing machines were whirring away. Turkish Cypriot workers, many moustached men, or as many moustached men as there were women, all working furiously on clothing for the West End fashion trade and shops. Decline had been harsh on Stoke Newington. It was obvious. There were signs everywhere. Church Street and Avenue Park Cemetery, we visited often. But what I remember, it was not until the mid-80s that you can actually go through the side gates off Church Street. The cemetery was 3/4 impassable, and only the main paths could really be used. It was far from today's romantic Gothic experience. Dope, smoking, and sex were 2 favoured pastimes. In this section of my talk, I'd like to cover something a little bit less tangible. The idea of moods, God forbid, even ethereal. Stoke Newington has and still evokes strong moods in me, and I suspect many others. This photo of Church Street in 1900 for me captures a mood before the decline of the 1920s and 1930s and the big social changes associated. This shows the site of the town hall. For me, it set a pervasive mood, a sort of ghost of well-off Georgian Stoke Newington, mansions and stripped little boarding schools. Elegance, geometric architecture. My next Stoke Newington mood shows the New River on the south side of Church Street, dating from 1949. I think it mirrors the 1980s mood perfectly, of faded grandeur, a past with an unknown future. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a sense of mood of decay hung over London and Stoke Newington in particular. This mood was one of jobs lost or moved elsewhere. Shrinking institutions. However, this mood was beginning to change. The national trend, with early shoots flowering in the inner city in London, moved away from demolition to conservation. So work began on breathing new life into Stoke Newington's large institutional buildings, particularly here on the High Street. The first large renovation projects began with the help of Hackney Council. Another mood for me kicked in almost every time when I walked past the impressive Egyptian-style gates of Avenue Park Cemetery. Religion is an essential part of the Stoke Newington mood. Non-conformism, tall Anglican steeples standing in judgment, Hasidic Jewish celebrations such as Purim pouring crazily out into the street. But for me, the main one was Booth's burial. Once I'd seen that photo in the archives, it didn't haunt me, but it kept coming back. Booth, the co-founder of the Salvation Army. This gathering would have been the largest gathering possibly ever in Stoke Newington's history. On the 29th of April, 1912, one newspaper report wrote 5,000 Salvationists in uniform marched through the city from the Army's headquarters in Queen Victoria Street with 40 army bands playing the Dead March from Handel's Saul. past huge crowds up to Abney Park Cemetery in Stoke Newington, where the general was buried beside his wife Catherine, the army's co-founder. There was always a strange exotica to the area, hard to put your finger on, but visually strong. So continuing with my story, venturing around the corner to the high street, it felt like entering a new world, and a much busier world at that. Two noticeable places sprung up for me. They were both around the junction with Cazenove Road. The Egg Store was the first shop in London that I'd come across. The revelation of cheap bagels, wonderful egg mayonnaise, and smoked salmon and cheesecake was an eye-opener. So was the kosher labelling on all the produce. I'd never seen it before. The next place to throw down a challenge was Madame Lily's, with its huge peeling corsetry sign, visible high up the shop front. Well, this place had quite a reputation. Coming home after hours, I frequently saw smartly dressed Afro-Caribbeans climbing out of large American cars. These stood out like a sore thumb against the Morrises and the Hillmans and the Fords. They would decant their passengers here at all hours. The women were even more glamorous than the men. The word went round the area it was just the front for a brothel. At first, Madame Lily's had cracked and peeling brown paint. Then the frontage was painted at some expense and took some time in glossy chocolate fudge brown. And late night high-class dining was painted in fancy Edwardian gold italicized writing on the window. This just underlined what everyone suspected. It could not have been more incongruous than with its neighbours Rabinovitz, the kosher butcher next door, and the whole food shop opposite that introduced macrobiotic food to the area. So Clissold Park, I love that walkway into Clissold Park through the cemetery, walking past the camouflage town hall, the old gas lights with the row of Georgian and Queen Anne buildings on the other side of the road behind. I used the Georgian front door from the old row that was replaced by the town hall for the logo of my publishing business, Architects Publications, which I set up at home in Lordship Road in 1986. Further up Cazenove Road, the Crays had a hideaway at Cedra Court, an anodyne 1930s mansion block, more like a granny flat than a murderer's hideout. And a few blocks south, Jack the Hat McVitie was murdered in his home in Evering Road in 1967. This was part of a Stoke Newington mood you could never quite touch, but you felt was around the corner or behind you. All in all, this just added to the exotic, slightly dangerous, peeling sleaziness. And another nice little anecdote. We used to get Canadian geese flying towards our flat from the lakes, following the course of Gray's Brook. And just as you thought they would come crashing through our kitchen window, they would veer right over Gray's Brook Primary School. Why did I write and produce the Stoke Newington Lifestyle Guide? Maybe I asked myself that question many times, both at the time, afterwards, and now. Thatcher's Big Bang had happened. The City of London was let off the leash. The old bowler hat and school tie brigade were on the back foot. London was going international. You could see new Skypers going up 5 miles to the south. I could see Stoke Newington, and in particular, Church Street, was changing. The Rochester Castle on the High Street had been bought by an unknown man called Tim Martin and his company Wetherspoons. It was the second or third pub that group had owned. Church Street had a new Californian diner called Mulholland Drive. Robbie Richards and his wife Carol had opened La Fin de la Chasse, a French restaurant. Rioja had arrived in Stoke Newington. Famous faces were seen about Stoke Newington. Comedian Alexei Sale lampooned the area with his skit about the Stoke Newington denim growers and yoghurt weavers.
All right, good evening. And my name's Alexei Sale. I'm actually a journalist. I'm a gossip columnist on What's On in Stoke Newington. Yeah, you might have seen it. It's a big piece of paper with fuck all written on it, you know. The lifestyle in Stoke Newington is terribly alternative, you know. It really is. I mean, everybody's growing their own denim, you know. And I actually knit my own yogurts.
I had become enchanted with the local architecture. I hadn't seen it elsewhere in the places I'd lived in London. Albion Road's cubit villas to the Brownwood Road lion pillars, the tessellated paths and tiled doorways, Bethune Road's Allen buildings and the secret gardens around the back. The chateau-like pumping station and Yokeley Road's prim Victorian villas. Class war and anarchy were highly visible in Stoke Newington, particularly 1987 to 88, the period of publication. 87 was an angry year nationally, and particularly in Hackney and Stoke Newington. Unemployment had begun to fall, but was still close to 12%. It's 4.8% today, and that's in a COVID crisis. Anger at Barclays and apartheid. Anger at black deaths in custody at Stoke Newington police station. Class wars promoting its anti-yuppie agenda and collective working class violent action, organising bash the rich marches. They saw elections as bourgeois conspiracies. The local Tory party HQ in Stamford Hill was burnt down. The tension went up another notch. I remember feeling a bit threatened, particularly uneasy. By 1988, 120 flats were occupied as squats on the Stamford Hill estate, and Hackney Council were forced to call in the police to undertake a mass eviction. 1987 saw the election of the first black woman to Westminster, Hackney North and Stoke Newington's Diane Abbott. Our red front door on Lordship Road stood out, so we got targeted. Our dustbins were set on fire, loads of leaflets and a few nasty feces were posted through the letterbox. So, on to the Stoke Newington guide. What, how and when, putting my history teacher's hat on. I had the idea of creating the ultimate architectural guide to Stoke Newington. That was the start. The directory was to be the final section, the source of finance for the whole project. I planned to resign from teaching, but for the first 6 months, I had to use my evenings, weekends and holidays to keep the cash flow going. This clearly wasn't enough time. I was behind schedule. I wanted to get things moving, so I took the plunge and resigned from my teaching post. I just got a pledge of £1,000 from Hackney Archives. That's over £3,000 in today's money. And I'd applied and got an enterprise allowance grant from the government for setting up. I got this for setting up a new business. It was a way of massaging the chronic unemployment figures. It was £50 a week, equivalent to £150 a week today. I spent 9 months going to the Hackney Archives and plotted and undertook to go around every road in Stoke Newington and architecturally describe every building. I mapped out the entire metropolitan borough, dating from the 1900s, covering Newington Green to Blackstock Road in Finsbury Park, up to the New River bordering Haringey in the north, and added Dear Cazenove Road for good measure. Using building plans and applications held in the archive, I researched the builders and dates of every house and estate in the old borough. There was a noticeable groan from the Take No Prisoners old school archivist every time I walked into the archives, knowing I would be requesting another trolley of documents and photos. I was swept away by the romance and the excitement, the discovery and the visual joy of all corners of the borough. But reality soon dawned. I then started running out of money. Just at this time, the archives told me they had decided to reallocate the promised money to a picture postcard book. My wife and my 2-year-old daughter, Emily, had to go and live with my mother in the southwest so we could keep our heads above water, and we had to rent out a room in the flat. In moved 2 Icelandic students, and at some point, the Icelandic Olympic female handball team. I put the history book on hold and had to get on with the commercial section. I started my sales career one rainy night, a week before Christmas in 1986. And I persuaded the Pakistani owner of the only late night shop in the area at the time to sign up for an ad. I think I managed to sell some £3,500 worth of advertising, purely off my own bat, but sales had dried up. So it had clearly become time to publish. In 1987, it was a very different world. There was no online world. Yellow Pages was enormous, even multi-volume. It was the only place to find a trade or anything you needed, any emergency services. But it had no notion of quality or relevance or a personal touch, which is where I felt there was a niche where I could step in. Stoke Newington, as I said, was changing quite rapidly. This was going to be the guide to put newcomers and old-timers in touch with the main and best things around. Increasingly new places that most likely they didn't even know about. It would also include high quality restorers, furniture makers on the fringe of the borough. The design process was pre-Apple and pre-desktop publishing, and design was a local and family affair. Our dear neighbour, Jenny Scott, was my initial paginator and designer. She was a lovely, smiley Anglo-South African. I would research a section, write notes, sell the advertising, and then type up a section on my brand new Amstrad. Then drop the 4.5-inch floppy off downstairs to Jenny in the basement flat at 114 Lordship Road. And she would take it to her typesetters in Islington. The pages were traditionally processed by the typesetters and came back as photographic galleys, smelling of developing fluid. She stuck these galleys down with hot wax onto a hand-drawn grid. Often the wax was too thick or too hot to work with. Lots of pain for her with burnt fingers. I was fascinated. I'd never seen anything like it. After a bit of navel gazing, I roped in 2 more friends. Adrian Morgan was living up in Stamford Hill, ex-Hornsey Art College. He was taught by Flock and Law, spitting image fame. I needed him to produce my illustrations, those amazing scraperboard illustrations that divide all the sections. Secondly, a newish friend, Richard Gray, agreed to take over from Jenny on the design front. I was really fortunate. He, having produced the Live Aid official brochure for free, had been noticed by David Bowie, and he'd been commissioned to design, produce his Cirrus Moonlight tour and album cover. And then Queen. He remains their graphic designer to this day, having taken the last shot of Freddie Mercury alive. The guide was designed in Brewer Street, Soho, in the early summer of 1987. The guides were delivered to my flat. I remember them blocking the corridor, almost touching the ceiling. This brought the next job to mind, delivery. I got a prize from Hackney Gazette to include it as an insertion or to deliver it separately using their system. It was well beyond my means. They had to go fast or I had a tragedy on my hands. So I talked to my Kiwi colleague, Des Humphreys. We got 2 rucksacks with 4,000 guides in each. We covered 1 road at a time, he on one side, me on the other. It became a race. We were quite fit. We played a bit of rugby and football at the time. It took us 4 days and 4 nights. The task was done. We were exhausted. So I had to sell the flat. I moved back west with my wife and daughter and showed my Stoke Newington lifestyle guide to Cheltenham Borough Council. And off the back of it, became their publisher for 10 years. My publishing work grew, included the British Bar Federation and Bath. I retrained as an ICT teacher. Well, actually a history teacher, but I was too old. I was over 27, so therefore too expensive. In fact, I finished 2 years ago after 20 years teaching communication application software. Then I retired. I got bored and I've just gone back into marketing communications, which is what keeps me busy today. The guide was made by Adrian Morgan's unique illustrations. The humor, the clever ideas, capturing an old world and a new world all at the same time. It gave vital information. 24-hour dentists, hard to find in the pre-digital world, the world pre-internet. It gave lawyers, it gave chemists open, emergency plumbers, where to sort out your pet. One of the most successful sections was, of course, the food and drink section, typified Stoke Newington 1987. Just looking at it, there was 3 bakers in Church Street in that year and 1 down in Allen Road. An early good food pioneer was Robertson's at 163. He was offering English goat's cheese, something I'd never come across. Devon smoked meats and live yogurt. Thinking of Alexi Sale. Chaz and Dave's doing East End knees-ups on green lanes at Mulholland Drive, bringing the best of the West Coast and Mexican food with Sunday morning brunch coming to the area. We got a bit of coverage. We got a whole page in the defunct Robert Maxwell newspaper, the London News, and got a very tongue-in-cheek Francis Wheen bit from the Independent. The joy hit me when my daughter put me back in touch with Stoke Newington, due to this guide, the Stoke Newington History Association and Amir, and seeing that someone was actually selling the guide at £7.45 in Church Street. I was amazed. So if you want to find a copy, you may be able to find one on eBay. I only have 2 left and one of mine is full of mold. Okay, thank you very much for listening.